The rotors were already spinning when the laughter started. $22 million of aerospace engineering hung in the cold boulder, air blades turning, turbines screaming, concrete trembling beneath the feet of people who had, 30 seconds ago, been absolutely certain this was a joke. The man in the facility's uniform had not laughed with them. He had simply climbed into the cockpit, adjusted the seat, found the pedals without looking. Nobody in that hangar knew his name. Not really. They knew the cart, the squeaking wheels, the navy blue uniform with the embroidered title that nobody had bothered to read in 6 months. What they did not know, what the cameras now broadcasting to 11 million strangers did not know, was what his hands remembered. The collective rose. The aircraft left the ground, and the laughter stopped. The November air over Boulder hit like a blade. Not cold the way weather forecasters described cold. The kind that found the gaps in your collar, slipped down the back of your neck, reminded you that the Rockies didn't care about your plans or your problems, or the quiet war you were fighting inside your own chest. Every single morning, you got out of bed and decided to keep going. James Smith had been getting out of bed for 40 years. Some mornings easier than others. He pushed the cleaning cart through the side entrance of Apex Rotorcraft at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his shift technically started, because that was who he was, had always been. The man who showed up early, who double-checked, who read the room before walking into it and never, not once in 20 years of doing things that actually mattered, left a job half-finished. The cartwheels squeaked on the polished concrete, a soft, rhythmic complaint, like the building itself was registering his presence under protest. 6 months he'd been making this walk. Through the side door, past the security desk where a guard named Phil nodded without looking up, down the corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner, and something else underneath, something metallic and alive. The particular scent of machines that existed at the edge of what was physically possible. He knew that smell from a different life, a life that still lived somewhere behind his sternum, quiet most of the time, occasionally loud in ways he couldn't predict or control. The main hangar doors were already cracked open, facility maintenance having unlocked them at 5:30 per protocol. James guided the cart through the gap and stopped. He always stopped here. Just for a second, just long enough to look at it, without anyone watching him look. The Titan X8 sat in the center of the hangar floor, under a constellation of industrial lights that made the carbon fiber skin gleam like something that had been found rather than built. Long, aggressive. The rotor blades folded back in their resting position, gave it the posture of something that had just landed from somewhere very fast, and was deciding whether to leave again. The tail boom swept back at an angle that the engineers had clearly spent months arguing about. He could tell from the geometry that they'd gotten it right. He could also tell, from the particular way the stabilizers sat, that they'd made one compromise they probably weren't happy about. $22 million. 18 days to prove it was worth the number. James pulled his eyes away and started on the windows along the east wall. This was the job. Glass microfiber cloth, circular motion, no streaks. He'd learned the technique from a woman named Donna Jackson. On his 3rd day, a woman who'd been keeping this building functional for 11 years, and who had the particular competence of someone who understood that invisible work was still work, and that doing it right mattered even when nobody was counting. He liked Donna. She was direct, didn't waste words. Asked him once, maybe 2 weeks in, why a man with hands like his was pushing a cleaning cart, and when he said it was a long story, she'd nodded and said, most good answers are, and never asked again. He worked the east windows in 20 minutes. Moved to the instrument office that overlooked the hangar floor from a raised platform. Through the glass, he had a clear sightline to the Titan, and from this angle, he could see things the engineers standing directly beside it couldn't see. The weight distribution in the landing gear left skid carrying fractionally more load, which told him something about the fuel system layout. The slight asymmetry in how the main rotor hubs and sat, nothing catastrophic. The kind of thing you noticed after a few thousand hours, after you'd learned that helicopters, like people, had habits and preferences, and quiet complaints that only showed themselves to someone paying the right kind of attention. He was paying that kind of attention. He was also technically supposed to be cleaning windows. The microfiber cloth moved in circles. His eyes stayed on the Titan. There was a control response issue. He knew this without being told, because he'd been listening to the engineering team's conversations for 6 months the way you listen to weather before a flight, not to be social, but because the information was real and the consequences of ignoring it were permanent. The fly-by-wire system had a lag, 0.4 seconds in the collective response. He'd heard the number 11 different times, in 11 different conversations, with 11 different levels of alarm depending on who was speaking and how close they were to the people who made decisions. 0.4 seconds didn't sound like much. He knew what it felt like at 120 knots with a rotor, at full power. He knew because he had the muscle memory, because his right hand could still feel the ghost of a collective stick that hadn't been in his grip for 5 years, and that ghost had opinions about 0.4 second lags that no engineer with a simulation model would fully understand until they'd felt the wrong version of it happen in real air. He moved the cloth, didn't say any of this to anyone, kept his head down, kept his expression neutral, kept being the man in the navy blue uniform with the name embroidered on the back that nobody here had ever tried to read. James Smith, Facilities, Invisible, which was, he reminded himself, exactly what he needed to be. He'd had his name known. He'd had people read his name off briefing documents and stand up straighter when he walked into the room. He'd had junior officers take notes on things he said, had watched those notes travel through chains of command and become doctrine. He'd had the handshakes and the shoulder patches, and the weight of a career that meant something, that pointed toward something, that gave him a shape he could recognize in the mirror every morning. And then he'd had Laura's diagnosis, and then he'd had the piece of shrapnel, and then he'd had a folded flag and an empty house, and a 20-year-old son sitting across from him at a kitchen table neither of them knew how to be at without her. After all of that, he needed to be James Smith, Facilities. He needed the cartwheels squeaking on concrete. He needed Donna handing him a checklist at 6 a.m. and Phil nodding at the security desk, and a shift that ended at 3 p.m. sharp so he could call Kevin before dinner, so he could be present for at least one thing that couldn't be taken back. The clicking of heels on concrete started somewhere behind the main doors. He knew that sound before he saw the source. He'd been hearing it for 6 months, 2 or 3 times a week, always with the same cadence, quick, deliberate, not hurried but relentless. The walk of someone who'd decided where they were going before they stood up. Elizabeth Jones entered the hangar the way weather systems enter a valley, not loud, not theatrical, just suddenly present in a way that changed the pressure of the air around everyone else. 34 years old, 5'8" without the heels that added another 2 inches. Dark brown hair cut precisely, never a strand suggesting anything accidental. Blue eyes that were on any other face, the kind of blue that seemed warm. On hers they registered information the way instruments registered data continuously, without judgment, without sentiment. Black suit that probably cost what James made in a month. Shoes the color of a warning light. Beautiful in the way certain aircraft were beautiful. All function and intention. Nothing wasted. 20 people followed her through the doors. Assistants, engineers, project leads, the marketing team with cameras that had been a fixture at Apex since Elizabeth decided social media was part of the product. 2.3 million followers watching the future of Rotorcraft get built in real time. The content was slick and confident and always controlled. The way everything connected to Elizabeth Jones was controlled. James kept working. Moved to the next window. She stopped in the center of the hangar, directly below the Titan's rotor arc, and turned to face the group following her. The morning light from the high windows fell across her at an angle that would have looked staged if anyone had arranged it. Nobody had arranged it. It just happened, because that was, apparently, the relationship Elizabeth Jones had with light. Brian, her voice carried, not because she was loud, because she was precise, and precision in an acoustically reflective space travels better than volume. Walk me through where we are. Brian Thompson stepped forward. He was 45. Built like someone who'd spent his adult life in close proximity to machines that required physical strength and fine motor control, simultaneously. His face in the morning light showed 3 days of insufficient sleep, the particular kind of exhaustion that accumulates not from long hours but from spending those hours in a specific kind of dread. He'd been flying for 22 years. He'd flown in conditions that would make most people revise their definitions of acceptable risk. He was not a man who frightened easily. He looked frightened. We're still getting the lag in collective response during transition from hover to forward flight. He said it plainly, the way he'd clearly been practicing saying it, in a way that didn't sound like what it actually was. 0.4 seconds. It's consistent and it's not improving with the adjustments engineering made last week. 0.4 seconds. Elizabeth repeated it without inflection, just fed it back to him so he could hear it in the air between them. So everyone standing in the hangar could hear it too. That's the number. That's 23 days before the Department of Defense demonstration. And our chief pilot is telling me we have a persistent control lag that we've known about for. She glanced at Robert Williams, the oldest person in the room by 15 years, the one who'd been standing in this building when her father broke ground on the expansion. How long, Robert? Robert Williams was 62, white hair, thick hands, the face of a man who'd spent 4 decades believing that problems were only unsolved temporary states. He wore the look now of someone doing the math on several things at once and not liking any of the totals. 6 months, he said it quietly. We've known about the hydraulic integration issue for 6 months. 6 months again. Same technique, same silence after. The marketing cameras had shifted angles. One had moved to capture the Titan in the background, the subject and its problem in the same frame. James, working the windows in the elevated office above, watched all of it without turning his head. He'd seen this kind of leadership before. Not in aerospace. In other buildings, other pressures, other rooms, where someone with authority had confused volume and certainty for competence. He'd watched it play out in briefing rooms and on flight lines, had watched the people downstream of that kind of authority go very quiet in a particular way, not respectful quiet, but the quiet of people who'd done the math and knew the cost of speaking. The engineering team had gone quiet in exactly that way. Brian. Elizabeth took a single step toward the pilot, not aggressive, just closing a distance. You have 8,400 hours. You've flown in conditions where people were actively attempting to. I know what I've flown in, not rude, just not deferential either. 22 years had given him that much. And I know the difference between acceptable risk and a system behavior that I don't trust. I don't trust this one yet. The lag is compensable, but at full demonstration specs, at the airspeeds and maneuver profiles Diod wants to see, it's a factor I can't account for with technique alone. Then get technique that's sufficient. Something shifted in Brian's posture, a small thing, the kind of micro-adjustment a person makes when they've decided to hold a position that's going to cost them something. With respect, that's not how this works. The hangar went to a particular quality of silence. James moved his cloth in slow circles and watched Robert Williams close his eyes for half a second the way people closed their eyes when they were watching something fall toward a floor and had no way to interrupt the trajectory. Robert. Elizabeth turned without any of the anger the moment seemed to warrant. Still precise, still controlled, which was, James had learned, actually more dangerous than anger. Is the aircraft safe to fly at full demonstration parameters? Yes or no? Robert opened his eyes. At limited, yes or no? He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than anyone in the room was comfortable with. No. The word landed. Nobody moved. Elizabeth looked at Brian Thompson for 3 seconds. Then you're dismissed. HR will have paperwork ready by noon. The room did not react all at once. The reaction was staggered. People processing at different speeds, some immediately, some delayed by disbelief that the sentence they'd just heard was the sentence that had actually been spoken. Brian's expression didn't collapse. That was the thing about men who'd been flying in dangerous places. For a very long time, they didn't collapse. He simply looked at her, then at the Titan, and then he nodded once and walked toward the exit with the same bearing he'd walked in with, and the sound of his footsteps was the loudest thing in the hangar until they weren't. Robert's tablet was in his hands. He was looking at it, the way people looked at documents when they needed a reason not to make eye contact. Someone on the marketing team made the mistake of letting a camera motor whir in the silence. I need a pilot who will fly my aircraft. Elizabeth addressed this to the general air above the assembled group, not someone who will find reasons not to. If anyone here has suggestions about where to look, now would be the time. Nobody spoke. This was the part. This was the moment James had recognized forming like weather for the past 40 minutes. The moment he'd told himself he was not going to be part of. The moment he had very specific and considered reasons for walking past. He had a cart to push. He had windows to finish. He had a shift that ended at 3, and a phone call to make, and a life built on the deliberate practice of staying inside his own lane, because his lane was the only lane that kept Kevin's world stable. The cloth moved in circles. Elizabeth's gaze traveled the room. It stopped. James felt it before he saw it. That particular quality of attention when it lands on you across a distance. He had not moved. He had not done anything to invite it. He had been doing his job with the quiet competence of someone who'd been invisible for 6 months and intended to remain so. But something had shifted. He'd been watching the Titan. He'd been reading it. And apparently some part of that had been visible. You, her voice carried up to the elevated office with no effort, clear, precise. The man in facilities. What's your name? Every camera in the room found him simultaneously. The hangar's acoustics delivered the collective sound of 20 people turning in his direction. No avoiding it. He'd been addressed directly in front of a room of witnesses and cameras. He set the cloth down, came to the railing. James Smith. She said it the way she'd said every number this morning, fed it back to be examined. How long have you been working here? 6 months. 6 months of cleaning this building. A beat. Then something changed in her expression, not warmth exactly, but the particular calculation of someone who'd just identified a useful object. Do you have opinions about the Titan X8, James? You've been looking at it for 20 minutes. He hadn't realized anyone had noticed. The cameras adjusted. It's a well-built aircraft. He said it because it was true and because saying nothing had stopped being an option. Good weight distribution. The tail boom geometry is right. Is that right? She walked toward the base of the elevated office stairs. Controlled. And you formed this assessment, how exactly? From the window cleaning angle. A few people laughed. The nervous kind. The kind that comes from needing somewhere to put the tension in a room. I've been around helicopters. He kept his voice level. You can see a lot from up here if you know what you're looking at. James. She tilted her head slightly. Not mocking exactly. Something more calculated than that. Do you know what I'm looking at right now? A $22 million aircraft that my company built, that my team designed, that represents 3 years of work. And an $850 million contract. And I can't find a single person in this building with the nerve to fly it at the parameters it was designed to achieve. Pause. She let that breathe. So I'm standing in my own hangar asking my cleaning staff for opinions. What does that tell you about where we are? It was not actually a question. James recognized that too. He picked up the cloth. I'm sorry, I can't help with the pilot problem. He meant it precisely as it sounded, not defensive, not combative, just true. The window in the East conference room has a streak I missed. I should get back to it. Something shifted in her expression. The calculation recalibrated. If you could fly it. She said it to the room as much as to him. To the cameras, definitely. If you could get in that cockpit and take it up just once. Just around this hangar, I'd give you anything you asked for. Blank check. Name it. Laughter from the assembled group. The real kind this time. The relief of having somewhere to put the discomfort. James looked at her. Then he looked at the Titan X8. And this was the thing that nobody in that hangar understood. That the cameras couldn't capture. That the people who'd laugh about the clip later would not be able to see in the footage. He wasn't looking at it the way you look at something unfamiliar. He was looking at it the way you look at something you know very well, when you've been away from it for a long time, and the distance has not made it strange, has only made it more precisely itself in your memory, and seeing it in person again produces something that isn't excitement and isn't exactly grief, something in between, something with weight. I appreciate the offer. He picked up the cloth. I'll let you know if that changes. He heard the collective exhale as he turned back to the window, the laugh that someone let out, not unkind exactly, but performing for the cameras, the relief of the moment passing into something shareable. He heard Elizabeth's heels click away from the Titan as she redirected the group toward a debrief that would accomplish nothing. Because the actual problem was not addressable in a debrief. He worked East Conference Room windows for 18 minutes. His hands were steady, his chest was not. Donna handed him the afternoon route at 11:30 with the particular efficiency of someone who'd been running facility logistics long enough to make it look effortless. She was 52, strong-boned and direct, with the face of a woman who found most of the drama around her mildly amusing rather than alarming. You're famous, she said. I'm not. 7 million views, apparently. She handed him the clipboard. Upper level, north end, exec bathrooms. and the engineering wing conference rooms. Rodriguez is out sick again. Is he actually sick, or take his route? He took the clipboard, didn't ask about the video, she didn't offer. Donna. He stopped. The man they let go this morning, Brian Thompson. She looked at him, steady. He was right about the aircraft. James said it flat. Whatever the politics of it are, technically he was right. I know he was. She pulled the clipboard back, checked something, handed it back. This building knows it too. Has known it for a while. She looked at him with the particular directness she used when she'd decided something was worth saying. Doesn't always help. He took the route. The engineering wing conference rooms were the most revealing spaces in the building. Not because of anything on the walls, the whiteboards were usually cleared, the printouts face down, the screens password protected, but because of what was left in the trash. Because of how the chairs were arranged. Because of the specific flavor of residue a room retained after people had spent hours in it being afraid of something they couldn't say out loud. James emptied the bins, stacked the errant chairs, wiped the tables. He found under the secondary table by the window a single printed page that someone had clearly intended to throw away and missed. Engineering spec sheet, hydraulic system integration diagram with handwritten notes in the margin. He picked it up. He wasn't reading it. He was going to put it in the trash with everything else. He read it. The hydraulic pressure compensator was optimized for steady-state flight. The spring rate was set for cruise parameters. What nobody had apparently written in the margin, but what he could see immediately in the diagram, the thing that only registered if you'd physically felt what a mistuned hydraulic compensator felt like at the moment of transition, the specific sensation of a machine hesitating between what it had been told to expect and what was actually happening to it, was that the lag wasn't a software problem. The software was doing exactly what it had been told. The lag was in the physical response of the hydraulic circuit at the moment of rapid demand change. Adjustable, fixable, not in 18 days, not at full demonstration specs, but fixable. He put it in the trash, moved to the next room. Robert Williams was in the next room. He'd clearly been waiting, not in an ambush sense, in the sense of a man who'd made a decision about something and chosen a location that would give them privacy, and had then gone there and waited. Robert was 62, and looked it without the additional weight of worry that had aged half the engineering team beyond their years. He had white hair and thick hands and the patient face of someone who'd spent 40 years watching problems reveal their own solutions when you gave them enough time and attention. He'd been at Apex before it was Apex, back when Richard Jones had been operating out of a facility a third this size with a team that fit around 2 tables. James had quietly established over 6 months of working around the man, been watching James for weeks. "I've been waiting to speak to you," Robert said. He was standing by the window, not sitting, his tablet in his hands in the way he always held it, not looking at it, just holding it, the way some men held tools they weren't using. "Since about week 3, actually, when I watched you do a walk-around of the Titan at 5:50 a.m. before anyone else was in the building." James started on the first trash bin. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Robert said it without heat. "You checked the swash plate bearings. You knew where they were without looking. You also spent 4 minutes looking at the tail rotor assembly from an angle that only makes sense if you're thinking about asymmetric load distribution." A pause. "I'm 62 years old. I've been around rotorcraft my entire adult life. I know what curiosity looks like, and I know what familiarity looks like, and those are not the same thing." James moved to the second bin. "You flew." Robert didn't phrase it as a question. The bin was empty. James lifted it anyway, a long time ago. "What platform?" The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone walked past in the corridor. James waited until the footsteps passed. Several. Robert looked at him for a long moment. His expression had the quality of a man doing arithmetic on something he didn't want to be wrong about. "The video is at 9 million views." He said it without emphasis. Someone in the comments section wrote, "If that man actually knows helicopters, this is the best story of the year." He set his tablet down on the conference table. "I tried to find your service record. I couldn't find much. I'm not easy to search," I noticed. Another pause. "Why?" James looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. "Because after my wife died, I didn't want to be found. And after that, I stopped being findable." Robert was quiet. "I'm sorry about your wife." "Thank you. I'm also going to say something else." Robert's voice didn't change in texture or weight, just kept coming, even and direct. I don't know what happened to you or what you're carrying. And I'm not asking. But that aircraft needs someone who actually understands it. Not just someone brave enough to sit in the seat. What I watched you do this morning, the way you looked at the Titan before you looked away, that wasn't curiosity. He picked up his tablet. Whatever you decide to do with that is your business. I just wanted you to know that I see it. James finished the room, replaced the liner, set the bin back. I'll be in the East Wing if you need more time, Robert said. He walked out without waiting for a response. James stood in the empty conference room for a moment. Just a moment. His truck was a 2019 Ram 1500 that had seen better years, which James had bought used because it ran and it got him where he needed to go, and those were the only criteria that had mattered at the time. He sat in it in the parking area designated for facilities vehicles, the far lot, the one that didn't have the Tesla chargers or the covered spaces, and ate the turkey sandwich he'd made at 6:15 this morning and tried not to think about what Robert Williams had said. He tried also not to think about the hydraulic diagram he'd read and thrown away. His phone was on the passenger seat. He watched it without picking it up. Then it buzzed. Kevin, a video call request, which meant whatever Kevin had to say required his face. He answered. Kevin Smith, at 19, looked the way people sometimes looked when they'd spent their whole childhood around someone and had absorbed everything about how that person moved through the world without being formally taught any of it. Dark eyes that were Laura's, the tilt of his head when he was thinking that was completely and entirely James, down to the millimeter. He was in his dorm room at CU Boulder, and behind him James could see the physics textbooks stacked in the specific organized by subject way that James had watched him develop starting at age 13. Whole floor has seen the video, but Kevin used the Vietnamese term for father that Laura had taught him when he was 3, from her own childhood, the word that had become theirs. The word that existed in exactly that spot between habit and intentional tenderness. Half of them think it's scripted. Other half are losing their minds. It wasn't scripted. I know. Kevin leaned forward slightly. I know because I watched how you looked at it. Before you said anything. Before she talked to you. You looked at that helicopter like, Kevin, like you were checking it. Like you were deciding something. James looked at his sandwich. You have a fluid dynamics exam Thursday. I'm aware. Are you prepared? I'm calling you from a dorm room at 7 million views because my father is in a viral video and you want to talk about my fluid dynamics exam. I want you to pass your fluid dynamics exam. Kevin's voice shifted, softer. The way it got when he wasn't performing anything. What actually happened today, not the video. Tell me. The mountains were visible from where James sat. They always were, from almost anywhere in Boulder. The Rockies didn't let you forget they existed. They sat at the edge of every sightline, every morning, every season, snow-capped and permanent and entirely indifferent to whatever was happening in the flat city at their feet. They fired the pilot. James said it because Kevin would find out anyway, and because he'd been telling Kevin the truth about hard things since the boy was 12 years old, and there was no reason to stop now. He was right about the aircraft. They fired him anyway. Kevin was quiet, and you didn't say anything. I said something. James folded sandwich wrapper precisely. I said something I shouldn't have and then I stopped. What did you say? That she was looking for the answer in the wrong place. Another quiet. Kevin processed things the way his mother had processed things, not immediately but not slowly either, thoroughly. He was building a structure out of the information and checking it before he spoke. If you know how to fix what's wrong with that helicopter, Kevin, and you didn't say anything, Kevin. His voice was gentle, clear. It's not that simple. Explain how it's not simple. Because getting involved means being visible. And being visible from here becomes something that pulls in directions I'm not prepared to go. Because I have a job that starts at 6 and ends at 3. And that lets me call you before dinner. And that has health insurance that covers the L4 nerve damage. That will eventually require surgery that costs more than my truck. He looked at the mountains. Because I have a life that works. And working lives are not things you dismantle, because someone on the internet thinks you should. Kevin sat. With that, I hear you, he said finally. I do. A pause. But you were looking at that helicopter like it was the only thing in the room. I look at it every morning, I know. Kevin's voice was quiet, not pushing anymore, just present. I know you. James stayed in the truck for another 4 minutes after he hung up. The mountains didn't move. The wind moved around them. Everything else adjusted. He drove back in for the afternoon route. The day finished unremarkably. Exec bathrooms, upper level, north end conference rooms, the break room where someone had microwaved fish at 11 a.m., and the vent was still processing the consequences. Donna signed off his hours at 3:02 and told him Rodriguez had texted that he'd be back Thursday, which she clearly didn't believe. And James didn't say anything about that because it wasn't his conversation to have. He drove the 40-minute route to the west side of Boulder, past the Whole Foods and the climbing gym, and 3 coffee shops that had all opened within 6 months of each other and were all still somehow operating, which he'd decided was a Boulder-specific phenomenon that he'd stopped trying to understand. He parallel parked on a residential street, 3 blocks from the house he rented. He always parked 3 blocks away when there was street parking, habit from years of not bringing his vehicle directly to a location, and walked the rest. The house was a 2-bedroom rental with a kitchen that faced west and a backyard that was mostly gravel because he hadn't gotten around to planting anything and wasn't sure he would. It was the right size. It was paid on time. It had working heat and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests, and neighbors who were quiet on the days that mattered. He made dinner. Nothing complicated. Chicken, rice. The good hot sauce Kevin had brought back from his first week of college like a peace offering from an undiscovered country. He ate at the kitchen table. Laura's photo was on the bookshelf. It had been there since the first week he'd moved to Boulder, when he'd unpacked the box of framed photos first, before the dishes, before the linens, because some things had a priority that didn't require justification. The photo was from a camping trip 6 years ago, her hair down, no makeup, laughing at something he'd said that he couldn't remember now. The mountains behind her doing exactly what mountains did in photos of people you loved. Providing context, making everything else look smaller and more precious simultaneously. He looked at it while he ate. Interesting day, he said. To the photo, to himself, to whatever remained of the habit of telling her things. After dinner, he called Kevin again, brief. The checking-in version. Kevin was studying. James told him to hydrate, which Kevin always rolled his eyes at and always did. They said goodnight in the specific way they'd developed since Kevin left for school. Not "I love you," because that was assumed, but a specific exchange that was theirs. A small ritual that bridged the distance without making the distance feel like a problem. He washed the dishes. He sat at the kitchen table with the phone face down. Then he opened the drawer. The military ID was there, behind the utility bills and the spare battery and the takeout menu he'd never thrown away from a restaurant that had probably closed. He didn't take it out. He just looked at it. The laminate was yellowed at the edges. The photo was him at 32, which felt like a different person who'd borrowed his face and his hands and his particular way of holding himself when something required him to be fully present. Lieutenant Colonel James Smith, United States Air Force, tactical flight instructor. He closed the drawer. He sat in the kitchen for another 20 minutes. He was thinking about a hydraulic pressure compensator, about the spring rate in the diagram he'd thrown away, about the specific sensation, physical, muscle memory level specific, of a collective that hesitated between what a pilot asked and what a helicopter delivered, and the fraction of a second in which everything about the next 10 seconds of your life was decided. He was thinking about a hangar full of people who needed something he had, and a cart he pushed, and a shift that ended at 3. He was thinking about the woman with the blue eyes and the red shoes who'd looked at him not like a person but like a problem she hadn't categorized yet. He was thinking about Robert Williams saying, "I just wanted you to know that I see it." He was not thinking about getting involved. He went to bed at 9:43. He did not sleep well. Outside, Boulder's particular version of November dark settled over the flats and climbed the foothills and made the mountains disappear into the sky as though they'd never been there. Though they had, though they always were, patient and unmoving and entirely themselves regardless of who was looking or what they needed, or how many reasons they'd given themselves for not looking up. The second morning hit different, not the weather. The weather was identical. Boulder in November running the same gray-edged playbook it had been running all week. Frost on the windshields, breath visible in the parking lot, the mountains doing their usual thing of existing enormously in the background of everyone's smaller problems. The difference was not atmospheric. It was the particular quality of a building that had processed something overnight and hadn't finished processing it yet. James felt it the moment he came through the side entrance at 5:44. Phil at the security desk looked up this time. Not just nodded, actually looked. That was new. He didn't slow down. Caught through the gap, east corridor, standard route. Except the corridor wasn't empty the way it was at 5:44. 2 engineers were standing near the water fountain with coffee cups, and the body language of people who'd been in a conversation that they paused when someone walked by. They watched him pass. One of them started to say something and stopped. James kept moving. The hangar doors were open, which was also new because maintenance didn't unlock the main hangar until 5:30, and it was 5:47 and both doors were standing wide. He came through and immediately understood why. The hangar was already occupied, not by a full team, by Elizabeth Jones, Robert Williams, and 3 engineers whose names James had learned from 6 months of reading the name tags. Nobody thought he was reading. They were standing around the Titan, with tablets and printouts, and the specific arrangement of people who have been something long enough that the professional performance has dropped away, and what's left is the actual problem, unfiltered. Elizabeth hadn't gone home. He could tell because the suit was the same one from yesterday, and her hair, which had been precise at 7 a.m. yesterday, had developed the particular quality of precision that had been maintained by will rather than by freshness. She was still put together. She was put together the way certain aircraft were still flying on the strength of engineering and stubbornness, not on the strength of reserve. She was talking to one of the engineers about the hydraulic schematic on his tablet, and she did not look up when James came through the doors, which was fine, expected, normal. Except Robert looked up. Robert gave him the particular look of a man who had a question he was going to ask later. And then he went back to the tablet discussion, and James went to the supply closet for the East Wing solution kit and started on the morning windows. The thing about working in the same space as people who are under pressure is that you absorb the pressure through proximity. 6 months had made him fluent in the specific emotional climate of Apex Rotorcraft, the way you became fluent in any language by immersion, not by studying the rules but by listening until the patterns arrived in your understanding without translation. He knew when the engineering team had hit a genuine breakthrough versus when they'd hit a plausible-sounding dead end they were choosing to believe in, because the deadline required belief. He knew when the marketing discussions were covering for a technical problem versus when they were genuinely producing something. He knew, without anyone telling him, that the conversation happening around the Titan at 5:50 a.m. on the second morning was not a breakthrough conversation. It was a not yet conversation, which was honest, and which, in his experience, was also the conversation that tended to turn dangerous when the clock ran out of patience before the solution did. He worked through the east windows, moved to the overhead office, positioned himself where the sight line to the hangar floor was clean. The engineering team was focused on a specific section of the hydraulic diagram. He could see the printout from this distance, a color-coded schematic, the kind generated by the CAD system, with handwritten annotations in 2 different marker colors, which meant at least 2 separate people had been physically looking at the same diagram at different times and had not been in communication when they made their notes. The annotated section was exactly what he'd identified from the discarded diagram yesterday. The pressure compensator. One of the engineers, a woman in her early 30s whose name tag read K. Chen, was making a point about the spring rate with the kind of careful precision of someone who was 90% sure they were right and waiting to see if the room agreed before fully committing. Elizabeth was listening with the full quality of her attention, which was James had come to understand actually considerable. Whatever she did with the information once she had it was a separate question. But the collection of it was genuine. Robert caught James looking. He didn't say anything, he nodded once, barely. James moved the cloth in circles. The team dispersed at 7:15 when the building population started filling in around them. Other employees arriving, the professional performance reasserting itself. Elizabeth went to her office. The engineers went to their wing. Robert stayed, making notes on his tablet, seated at the secondary workstation that maintenance had placed along the north wall of the hangar 3 years ago, for exactly this kind of extended session. James was restocking the supply cart when Robert walked over. Kei Chen has been right about the pressure compensator for 4 months. Robert said it without preamble, the way he said most things. She put it in writing twice. The first time it got routed to a subcommittee. The second time it got categorized as a Phase 2 concern. Phase 2 being after the demonstration. Phase 2 being after the demonstration. James checked the microfiber cloth count. 14. He needed 16 for the full route. He went back to the supply closet. Robert followed him. I'm not asking you to do anything. Robert leaned against the door frame. I want to be precise about that. I'm not asking. I'm telling you a fact, which is that the person who understood the problem earliest is a 31-year-old engineer who has been systematically not heard for the better part of this project's timeline, and that the person who could most effectively communicate what she knows in a way that would actually land that person has a reason not to be in this building at all. And I'm aware of that. And I'm still standing in the supply closet doorway at 7:20 a.m., telling you this, so make of that what you will. James counted the cloths. He had 16. He'd miscounted before. What's her analysis, he said. The spring rate is set for cruise. The accumulator is undersized for rapid demand transition. Lag is physical, not software, adjustable. He had known this from the diagram yesterday. He had thrown the diagram away and gone home and made chicken and rice and looked at Laura's photo and gone to bed at 9:43. She needs the right frame, Robert continued. Chen knows what she's talking about. She doesn't know how to make it undeniable to someone who needs the certainty of a pilot's testimony, not just the math. That's not my job. No. Robert straightened. It's not. He walked back toward the hangar. I'll be at the North Workstation until noon if you have questions about the route schedule. He didn't have questions about the route schedule. He knew the route schedule by heart. He pushed the cart toward the engineering wing and tried to be, simply and completely, the man in the navy blue uniform with the squeaking wheels. It was harder than yesterday. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because Robert had said Kei Chen's name. Maybe because putting a name to the person who'd been right and systematically unheard made it specific in a way that the general injustice of the situation had not required him to confront directly. Maybe because he'd spent 20 years caring about the difference between problems that were solvable and the gap between solvability and actual solution. And that gap in this building was not abstract anymore. It was a hydraulic compensator and a spring rate and a 31-year-old engineer who'd been categorized as a Phase 2 concern. He was 40 years old. He had been other things. He was currently the man with the cleaning cart. The engineering wing conference rooms were in the same condition. They always were at 7:30, printouts on the table, half-finished coffees, someone's jacket over a chair. He worked through the first 2 rooms without incident. In the 3rd room he found Kei Chen. She was sitting at the far end of the conference table, with a laptop and a paper printout, and a yellow legal pad filled with equations in a handwriting that was trying very hard to be legible, and not entirely succeeding. She was slight, wearing an Apex Rotorcraft badge that had seen better days, and she looked up when James came in with the particular expression of someone who's been so focused they've lost track of how much time has passed. Sorry, she said automatically. I can move if you need. You're fine. He started on the trash bin by the door. I'll work around you. She went back to the legal pad. He worked the room quietly. She wrote equations. He collected the papers from the recycling bin, which contained, he noted, without slowing, 3 separate printed versions of the same hydraulic schematic, each with different annotations. Would you treat them with kindness? Each representing a different point in the conversation about the pressure compensator that had apparently been happening in this room for months without reaching the person who needed to hear it. He was at the window when she said, without looking up, "You're the guy from the video. Word travels. 13 million views as of this morning." She turned a page on the legal pad. People in the comments keep saying if he actually knows anything about helicopters, which is obviously not. She paused. Unless it is. He sprayed the window. I've been around them. He moved the cloth. The spring rate. She looked up, sharp. What? The pressure compensator. The spring rate is set for cruise parameters. The accumulator is undersized for rapid demand transition. He kept working the window. That's why the lag is physical rather than software origin. That's why the software adjustments haven't resolved it and won't. Silence. He could feel her processing behind him. I've been saying that for 4 months. Her voice had gone very still. How do you? Because I've felt it. He turned to face her. In a different aircraft in different conditions. The sensation is the same regardless of the underlying architecture. You know what you're talking about. You need someone to say so in a room where it will actually land. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not simple. It was the expression of someone who has been right about something for long enough that being right has started to feel lonely. And being confirmed is not only a relief but a grief for all the time that passed before. "Who are you?" she said. He picked up the trash liner. "Facilities," he said. "East Wing route." He finished the room. He didn't look back on the way out, but he heard her chair push back, and he heard her start dialing before he reached the corridor. Good, he thought. And then, stay out of it. And then she needed the frame. And then you already did the thing. You already said the words. You can be done now. He was not done. He understood this by the time he reached the south stairwell. The way you understand something that's been true for longer than you've been willing to admit it, not suddenly, but inevitably. The way a fact that has been present in the room eventually occupies more space than everything else in the room and you stop being able to see around it. The Titan X8 had a solvable problem. He had the solution in his hands and his history and his 9,000 hours. And Brian Thompson had been fired for being right. And Elizabeth Jones was in a building full of people who had stopped believing their own accuracy was worth the cost of speaking it. And it was 7:53 a.m., and his shift was not supposed to matter, and his cart was outside the conference room, and nothing about any of this was his responsibility. He pushed the cart toward the main hangar. The morning team was assembling. Elizabeth had come back from her office. She was standing near the Titan with a posture that said she'd slept approximately nowhere, and was running entirely on the particular fuel of someone who equated stopping with losing. More people this morning than yesterday. Word had circulated about the video. Word had circulated about Brian. The atmosphere had that particular density of a building holding its breath. Elizabeth was mid-sentence to a project manager when she saw James come through the hangar entrance with the cart. She stopped mid-sentence. James kept walking. Same pace, same cart, same route, James. Her voice carried across the hangar in exactly the way it had yesterday. Clear, precise, not asking a question, using his name as a locating device. He stopped because avoiding it in a room full of cameras and witnesses was no longer a real option, and had not been a real option since approximately yesterday morning, and pretending otherwise was a form of dishonesty he'd never been comfortable with. He turned. "You came back." She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the calculation from yesterday, something more complicated, like someone who'd spent the night running a model and wasn't sure they trusted the output. "It's my shift, right?" A pause. She was making a decision. He could see it, the same way you could see a pilot deciding between two approach vectors, the body going quiet while the mind ran the numbers. "I owe you an apology for yesterday." The hangar registered this. A shift in attention. Not dramatic, just the particular attentiveness that follows an unexpected event. "You don't." He meant it completely. "You saw a man in a facilities uniform and you acted accordingly. That's what people do. I used you as entertainment. You used the moment as entertainment. There's a difference." He kept his voice even. "The moment invited it. I was holding a cleaning cloth." Something shifted in her expression. Not softened exactly. More like recalibrated. "Brian Thompson had 8,400 hours, she said. He was telling me the truth about the aircraft. Yes, I fired him for it, yes." The word landed both times without cushion, without redirect. He'd learned, in 2 decades of flight instruction, that the most useful thing you could offer someone who'd made a mistake was the unadorned fact of it. Not absolution, not escalation, just the clear air of acknowledgement. She stood with that for a moment. "Then, where does that leave us? With an aircraft that has a solvable hydraulic issue and 16 days left," he said it flatly, "and a pilot who was right, whom you need back if you want to solve it. Brian won't come back. Call him. He'll come back." Because he'd known pilots like Brian Thompson his entire career, men who wanted nothing except to fly correctly, who had no capacity for grudges, because grudges required you to hold something other than the aircraft in your attention. He wants to fix the problem. He doesn't want the argument. Elizabeth was looking at him with something that was starting to approach the real version of her attention rather than the managed version. The version that collected information without deciding in advance what to do with it. "The pressure compensator," she said. He went still. "Kay Chen has been saying it for 4 months. She held his gaze. She called me at 8:03 this morning. told me to read her original memo, the one from April, and told me that someone in facilities had confirmed her analysis in terms she hadn't heard anyone use since her doctoral thesis defense. A pause. That was you. He didn't confirm or deny it. James. Her voice dropped the broadcast quality. This was a real register. Who are you? He looked at the Titan, then at her. He put the card handles down. He reached into his jacket pocket, the worn leather one he wore over the uniform on cold mornings, and found his wallet. And from the wallet the card that had been in there for 5 years because he couldn't bring himself to take it out, and he handed it across. She looked at it. The processing time was longer than he'd expected. He'd expected the fast calculation, the immediate recalibration. What he got instead was something that looked like the framework she'd been working from, quietly rearranging itself at a structural level. The photograph on the ID was him at 32. And the title was the fact that had been sitting in his jacket pocket. Every morning he'd come through the side entrance and nodded at Phil, and pushed his cart past the Titan, and kept his eyes from staying too long. Lieutenant Colonel. Her voice was different. 12 years flying Blackhawks. 2 deployments to theater. Then 8 years as a flight instructor at Fort Novosel. He took the card back. 9,200 hours. Certified on 14 platforms. Instructor rated on 6. And you've been cleaning my building for 6 months. Doing my job, which needed doing. She absorbed this in the particular silence of someone who has just learned that the foundation of a structure they've been standing on was not what they understood it to be. The structure was still standing, but the ground beneath it had changed in quality. The nerve damage, she said finally. Left leg. Intermittent loss of sensation. The Air Force retired me with full honors and a 70% disability rating. He kept his voice neutral. The facts were not his enemies. My wife's diagnosis came 6 months after that. Stage 4, pancreatic. He looked at the Titan. After Laura died, I took the job that let me be a consistent presence for my son while he finished high school and then started college. It starts at 6 and ends at 3, and the insurance is adequate. And nobody asks me to be someone I've already finished being. The hangar was not quiet, but the 15 feet of space around them had the acoustic quality of privacy despite the surrounding movement. I used you as a prop. Her voice had gone tight in a way that wasn't anger. In front of cameras, in front of 2 million followers, you didn't know what you were using. It doesn't. He held her gaze. It doesn't fully excuse it, but it explains it. And understanding what happened is more useful than punishing yourself for it in ways that don't fix the actual problem. A pause, which is still a hydraulic compensator, and still 16 days. She stood for a long moment. The cameras on the marketing team were not running. He noticed this specifically, that at some point in the last 4 minutes, without being directed, the team had stopped recording, which was either instinct or decency or both. If I asked you, Elizabeth said carefully, to consult. Not permanently, not as a flight role, as a technical advisor, someone who can give Chen's analysis the credibility it needs in rooms where the math alone isn't landing. My shift ends at 3. I'm aware that's not a no. His chest was doing the thing it had been doing since yesterday morning. The thing he hadn't named because naming it felt like giving it more authority than he'd allocated to it. The pull that was not ambition, and was not ego, and was not the performance of being someone that the world had a use for. The pull that was simpler and older than any of that. The pull of a problem he could see the solution to, and tools in his hands that fit the work. Call Brian, he said, today. He picks up or he doesn't. If he picks up, you put him back on the flight line and you listen to every word he says about the aircraft from this point forward, without qualification or negotiation. If he comes back and says we need 4 additional weeks, you give him 4 additional weeks. He held her gaze. Those are the conditions. And if I agree, then I'll talk to Chen, and I'll talk to your hydraulics team, and I'll be here from 6 to 3 and available by phone until 8. And on the days Kevin comes home from Boulder, I leave at 2:30, and that is not negotiable. She looked at him for a long moment. Kevin, my son, University of Colorado, freshman year. Something moved across her face, not pity, something more complicated. The expression of someone who has been managing a company while standing on the assumption that the people around her existed primarily in relation to the company, and has just been handed, clearly and simply, evidence that they do not. Agreed, she said, all of it. He picked up the cart handles. I have windows in the North Conference Suite. He started moving. If you reach Brian before noon, text me. Robert Williams has my number. He heard her exhale behind him, not loudly, the particular release of someone who has been carrying something at the wrong angle and has just shifted the weight. He kept walking. He had 9 windows in the North Conference suite, and 15 minutes before the route would put him behind schedule, and the cart wheels were still squeaking the same note they'd been squeaking since October, and the building was the same building it had always been, except it wasn't quite. But that was a fact he could hold without examining it yet. Brian Thompson walked back into the building at 11:43 a.m. James was finishing the south corridor bathroom tiles when he heard the particular texture of footsteps that came from a man who had been asked to return somewhere he'd been asked to leave, and had decided the work was more important than the memory of the leaving. He heard Elizabeth's voice from down the corridor, shorter sentences than usual, more actual question marks. And he heard Brian's voice, which was the same as it had always been, the voice of someone who dealt in the observable world and found it sufficient. He finished the tiles, rinsed the mop head, moved to the next room. At 12:15, his phone buzzed. "Robert," she called Brian. He came. "They're in the hydraulics lab with Chen, you should know." He put the phone back. He did not go to the hydraulics lab. That was their conversation. He'd provided the frame. The work was theirs to do. This was how it was supposed to operate, not a rescuer arriving to fix what everyone else had failed at, but the right information getting to the right people in the right form, which was all he'd done, which was, in the honest accounting, what he'd always done best. Not flying, teaching, creating the conditions under which someone else could do the thing correctly. Would you treat them with kindness? He worked through until 2:50, signed off with Donna, who looked at him with the expression of someone who knew considerably more than she was going to say about anything that had happened in the building today. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine. That's what tired people say." She handed him the sign-out sheet. "Also, whatever you did this morning in engineering, Chen has been humming since noon. She doesn't hum. In 11 years I've never heard her hum." He signed the sheet. "Have a good afternoon, Donna." "You too, James." "A beat, Colonel." He stopped. Looked at her. "Robert talks to me sometimes," she said simply. "Has for years." He didn't say anything. She smiled, the particular smile of a woman who had no interest in making anything bigger than it needed to be. "Go call your son." He drove home through the November afternoon, past the Whole Foods and the climbing gym and the 3 coffee shops, and he thought about hydraulic compensators and spring rates and the specific sensation of a collective that hesitated and corrected, and what it meant to know the precise nature of a problem that someone else was now positioned to solve. He thought about the way Elizabeth Jones had stood in the hangar after he gave her back the conditions. The way her posture had changed by approximately 4 degrees. Not a collapse. Not a performance of being moved. Just the structural adjustment of someone who has received information that requires a new load-bearing arrangement. He thought about Brian Thompson walking back into the building with his particular bearing intact. He thought about Kei Chen humming. He pulled into the 3 blocks away parking spot, walked the rest, unlocked the front door. The house was quiet in the 4 o'clock way, the light coming through the west kitchen window at the low angle that meant the day was finishing, the mountains doing their disappearing act into the early dark. He called Kevin. Bah, immediate, which meant Kevin had been waiting. "Tell me," she called Brian. He came back. "Chen is working with the hydraulics team on the compensator, and you." "I talked to some people. That's all." "Bah." Kevin's voice carried something that was fond and exasperated in equal measure. "That is never all, and we both know it." He went to the kitchen window, the last light on the mountains, amber at the snow line, gray below. "She offered me a consulting role." He said it out loud for the first time, heard it in the air. "Technical advisory, part-time, 6 to 3, flexible for your visits." Kevin was quiet. "Then what do you want to do? Not what should you do? Not here's my opinion, what do you want?" Laura's question. Word for word. The question she'd asked him 12 years ago when the second deployment came up, and there was a choice about whether to volunteer for the extension. The question she'd asked him 3 years into his Fort Fovosel assignment when a position opened in Washington that would have been a different trajectory entirely. She had never told him what she thought he should do. She had asked what he wanted, and then she had listened to the answer as though it were the most useful information she would receive that day. Kevin had been 8 when she died. He'd learned it from photographs and stories and the 11 years since, and it lived in him so completely that he'd used it today, At 19, without knowing where it came from. I want to fix the problem, James said. That's what I want. Then do that. A pause. Bah. The problem in that building is bigger than the helicopter. He knew this. He'd been watching it for 6 months. I know. You can fix that too. I know it's not your job. Kevin's voice was gentle and firm at once. Do it anyway. The mountains were completely dark now. The city lights at the base of the foothills were doing the thing they did every November evening. Coming up slowly like the earth was trying to compete with the sky. James stood at the kitchen window and looked at the dark shape where the mountains were still there. Behind the darkness, permanent and undemonstrative. He had 9,200 hours. He had a hydraulic solution that would require 3 weeks to implement and test properly. He had 16 days. He had a son at 19 who sounded like his mother. He put the phone on the counter and started dinner, and did not think too carefully about the fact that tomorrow he was going to walk into a building where his name had changed in 1 day, from invisible to something else entirely, and that the change was permanent, and that the life he'd spent 18 months carefully assembling around the perimeter of his actual capabilities was going to require a different architecture going forward. He thought about chicken and rice. He thought about whether he had enough of the hot sauce. He thought about the fact that the cartwheels needed a different bearing, and he should tell maintenance before the end of the week. He thought about a hydraulic diagram. The thing about knowing the precise shape of a solution is that you can't unknow it. You can put it in a drawer. You can throw the printout away. You can go home and eat dinner and look at a photograph and tell yourself that other people's problems are other people's problems, and that the man in the navy blue uniform with the squeaking cart does not carry the weight of $22 million aircraft and $850 million contracts and a culture of silence that was already eating the building from the inside. You can tell yourself all of that. The knowledge stays anyway. At 7:15 his phone buzzed. Elizabeth. Not a call, he answered. Brian spent 2 hours with Chen, no greeting, straight to it. Which he'd come to understand was actually her more honest. Register. The formality of her public presentation required more management than the directness. They think the spring rate adjustment is a 3-week fix, maybe 2.5 with the full hydraulics team on it. That's what the timeline will be. It won't compress further without risking incomplete validation. Pause. The demonstration is in 16 days. I'm aware. Longer pause. You're going to tell me to delay. I'm going to tell you what the timeline is. What you do with it is your call. He heard her exhale, the sound of someone running a model they don't want to run because they already know the output. If I delay, she said carefully, Meridian has already completed their demonstration. We lose first mover advantage. You lose first mover advantage on a helicopter with an unresolved control lag, which Meridian's procurement officers are also evaluating. Except they don't know they're looking at a time bomb. He let that sit. The dude will know. In 6 months or 2 years they will absolutely know. And the company that told them the truth and asked for 3 more weeks will be a very different conversation than the company that delivered a known problem inside a demonstration. Silence. My father used to say. She stopped. He waited. He used to say that the most expensive thing a company can do is solve the wrong problem quickly. He was right. Another silence. Different quality. The kind where the decision is not being made because it hasn't been made yet, but because making it out loud will cost something. And the person on the other end of the line is finding their footing before they pay it. I'll call the DoD contracting office tomorrow morning. Flat, decided. The sound of a door closing on one version of events. I need you there when I brief the team. I'll be there at 6. James. A pause. The use of his first name in a register that wasn't the public address system of the hangar. Closer, more real. What you said today about using you as a prop, I want you to know I understand what that cost. It didn't cost me anything. That's not Elizabeth. He said her name the same way she'd said his. Direct, present, without ceremony. It was one morning. You didn't know who I was. I'd spent 6 months making sure you didn't. The accounting is more complicated than you're making it. A pause. Fix the helicopter. That's the cost. She didn't answer immediately, and in the silence he could hear, very quietly, the sound of someone who had spent a long time in a room they'd built out of certainty, beginning to understand that the room had more doors than they'd designed for. 6 a.m., she said. 6 a.m. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he put his phone face down on the counter, and he finished making dinner, and he ate it at the kitchen table with the mountain dark outside the window, and he thought about a spring rate, about an accumulator size, about the precise feeling of a collective that responded in the space between asking and receiving, which he had spent 12 years learning to trust and 8 years teaching other people to read. He thought about what it meant to be done hiding, not from other people, from himself, from the specific relief of being unreachable, which had been. He understood now in the way you understand things that have been true long before you admitted them, a form of grief dressed as practicality. Laura had told him once 3 months into her second round of treatment. On an evening when both of them had stopped pretending that optimism was the most honest available option, that the only thing worse than losing someone was letting the loss become the reason to stop being fully present to everything that remained. He'd agreed with her at the time. He'd spent 3 years being present to everything that remained in a way that specifically excluded the parts of himself that hurt. He looked at her photograph. "I'm going back in," he said to it, to her, to whoever heard these things, if anyone did, which he genuinely didn't. "No, not all the way. Just to the part I can reach." The photograph did what photographs did. He washed the dishes. He called Kevin to say goodnight. Kevin answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been waiting. "Well," Kevin said. "I'm consulting." 6 to 3, flexible. The sound Kevin made was not words. It was something shorter. The sound of a person who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. "Okay," Kevin said. "Okay, good. Study for your fluid dynamics exam." "I will." "Kevin, yeah. Your mother would ask what you wanted, not what you thought. What you actually wanted." He said it because it needed saying, because the boy had used her question today at 19 and deserved to know where it came from. "She asked me that for 12 years. I never told you where it came from. It came from her." A long quiet. "I know," Kevin said finally. "I've always known." He hung up. He went to bed. He lay in the November dark and did not think about whether he was making the right decision, because the right decision was the one where the aircraft got fixed, and the pilot got heard, and the engineer who'd been right for 4 months got the confirmation her analysis deserved, and the building got to be a place where truth was allowed to be expensive without being fatal. He'd made harder decisions in worse conditions with less sleep. He was 40 years old. He had 9,200 hours. The ceiling was dark. The mountains were dark. Tomorrow was 6 a.m. He closed his eyes and thought about spring rates until something finally let him sleep. The call to the Department of Defense happened at 7:48 a.m. on a Wednesday, which was otherwise an unremarkable morning in Boulder, except for the fact that Elizabeth Jones had not slept again and was sitting behind her desk with a legal pad of notes she'd made between 2 and 4 a.m. and a posture that communicated nothing about the internal cost of what she was about to do. James sat across from her, not at the conference table, at the small secondary table by the window, the one that didn't carry the weight of formal meetings. He was there because she'd asked him to be there, and because he'd said he would be, and those 2 facts were sufficient. He had coffee, she had water. He noticed she hadn't touched the water. She dialed. Speaker. Contracting office picked up on the 3rd ring. The man on the other end had the voice of someone who'd been in procurement long enough to have heard every version of every conversation that was about to happen, and his tone communicated this without being unkind about it. "Apex Rotorcraft." He said it like reading an entry. "Miss Jones, thank you for taking the call on short notice. No warm-up, no performance." She'd done the performance for 2 years and it had produced, among other things, a pilot fired for being accurate. "We have a technical issue that requires a 3-week extension on the demonstration timeline. I'm calling to tell you before the paperwork because you deserve the actual explanation, not the official version of it." A pause from Ohio. "We're listening." She explained it. The hydraulic compensator. The lag. The 6 months it had been present, and the 4 months the engineer who'd identified it had been systematically not heard. She explained it without softening any of those facts. James watched her face while she spoke and saw the particular quality of effort that was not about managing her own fear but about resisting the practiced instinct to make the hard parts less hard. Every sentence cost something. She paid it. The man in Ohio was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Meridian completed their demonstration 2 days ago," he said. "I know. This extension puts you at a competitive disadvantage. I know that too." A pause. "I also know that if I demonstrate a helicopter with an unresolved control issue, and those pilots spend the next 2 years flying it in conditions that reveal what we already know. That conversation will cost considerably more than 3 weeks. She looked at the legal pad. I'd rather be the company that told you the truth, even if that company loses the contract. Another silence, longer. Send the technical documentation, he said finally. Full engineering package. I'll have our evaluation team review it in parallel with your fixed timeline. It'll be on your server by noon, Miss Jones. A shift in his register. Not warmer exactly. More like the tone that someone uses when they're speaking plainly because the situation has earned it. This kind of call is rare. I want you to know that it's noted. She thanked him. Ended the call. The office went quiet in the way of rooms where something has been finished that cannot be undone. James picked up his coffee, looked at the mountains through the window, which at 8 a.m. in November were doing their thing of being fully present and absolutely indifferent. That was the right call, he said. I know. She set the legal pad down. It still felt like jumping off something. Most right calls do. She looked at him. For a moment she was not the CEO and he was not the consultant and the room was not the office with the window that cost someone's quarterly budget. She was 34 years old, and she'd just told the Department of Defense that she'd rather lose a contract than deliver a known risk, and she was sitting with what that cost, and he was across a small table with coffee, and that was the actual shape of the morning. My father would have made that call on day 1, she said. He would never have let it get to 6 months. Your father didn't inherit a company mid-crisis with the board watching every decision for evidence they'd been right to doubt him. He set the cup down. You built the armor you needed. The problem is, armor doesn't always know when to come off. She absorbed this without deflecting it. Is that from a manual somewhere? From 20 years of watching people fly in conditions they weren't prepared for and learning to tell the difference between the conditions that were the problem and the people who were. She picked up the water, drank it, set it back. We have 3 weeks, she said. Tell me what needs to happen, he told her. The next 3 weeks were, in the honest accounting, some of the most technically demanding of James's career. Not because the problem was more complex than things he'd worked through before, but because the problem existed inside a human system that had been running on fear for long enough that the fear had become structural. It was load-bearing, and removing load-bearing elements from a structure required replacing them with something else before the structure registered what it had lost. He worked with Kei Chen and the hydraulics team every morning from 6 until noon. In the afternoons he reviewed Brian's flight notes and cross-referenced them with the telemetry data from the early test runs, building a picture of exactly how the lag had manifested in real flight conditions at different power settings and airspeeds. This was the work that nobody else in the building could do, because it required reading a pilot's physical description of a machine's behavior and translating it backward into the mechanical cause, and that translation required having occupied both sides of the equation for a combined 2 decades. Chen was meticulous. She was also, he discovered quickly, someone who had learned to present her conclusions in a form specifically calibrated to not threaten the people she was presenting to, which had made her technically accurate and contextually invisible simultaneously. He spent 3 days helping her understand the difference between making her analysis accessible and making herself small, which was a distinction she grasped with the speed of someone who'd been waiting for permission to grasp it. By day 4 she was presenting her findings in the engineering team meetings, the way she'd been presenting them in her own head for months, direct, complete, without the apologetic softening that had let people route her to a phase 2 concern. The change in the room was not dramatic. It was quiet and permanent, the way real changes tended to be. Brian Thompson flew daily test sequences. James stood on the hangar floor with headphones and a telemetry monitor, and communicated with Brian through the ground crew system, and Brian described what he felt, and James translated what that meant, and the engineers adjusted, and they flew again. It was the most efficient diagnostic process the aircraft had seen since the project began, and everyone involved understood why, without having to say it. The spring rate adjustment went in on day 8. Day 9, Brian flew the modified configuration for the first time. James was at the telemetry monitor. Robert Williams was beside him. Kei Chen was at the data station. Elizabeth was standing 10 feet back, not from the action, but giving it the room it needed, which was a different kind of management than she'd been doing, and which everyone could feel without commenting on. Brian took the tighten up, hover, stable, collective transition forward flight. The moment that had been the problem for 6 months, the point of hesitation, the gap between ask and receive that had cost one pilot his position and nearly cost the company its future. Clean, immediate, responsive. James felt it in the telemetry data before Brian said anything. The numbers were right, not approximately right, correctly right, in the way that a properly tuned system was right, without the hesitation that had been printed into every prior dataset like a signature of something broken. Brian's voice through the headset, she responded. James looked at Chen. She was watching her screen, with an expression he recognized from his years of instruction, the expression of someone who had been right about something for a long time and had just watched the world confirm it, which was not triumphant, because it was also the expression of how long it had taken. Again, James said into the headset, full transition to cruise parameters, then back. Brian did it again twice, then at increasing airspeeds, each time clean. Robert Williams was not making notes on his tablet, he was just watching, his hands at his sides, the face of a man who'd been in this building when the foundation was poured, and who had spent 3 years after the founders' death watching it run on momentum and fear, rather than on the thing it had been built to run on, and who was watching now something he'd given up expecting. It works, Chen said, not loudly, to her screen, to herself first and then to the room. Elizabeth walked forward. She stood beside James and looked at the telemetry display with the expression of someone who has just paid a debt they'd been carrying for long enough that the carrying had started to feel normal. Day 9, she said quietly. 14 to go. He kept his voice flat. We use every one of them. And they did. The next 14 days produced more rigorous test data than the prior 6 months combined. Not because the team hadn't been working before. Because the team had been working in a system that punished accuracy, and accuracy, when systematically punished, goes underground. It doesn't disappear. It sits in legal pads and phase 2 concerns, and the private arithmetic of engineers who've calculated that being right has a cost they can't afford. And when the system stops punishing it, accuracy comes back up. Quickly, all at once, with the force of something that has been compressed. K. Chen found the harmonic resonance issue on day 18. James found it first, technically. He was reviewing an extended endurance dataset and saw the pattern of vibration signature building at a specific RPM band during sustained cruise, consistent enough to be a characteristic rather than an anomaly. The kind of thing that wouldn't manifest in short demonstration flights. The kind of thing that would show up at hour 47 of operational deployment on a day when nobody was looking for it. He brought it to Chen at 7:15 a.m. on day 18, showed her the data. She looked at it for 90 seconds and said, transmission mount, harmonic resonance. We need a damping system, 3 additional days minimum, possibly 4. She was already pulling up schematics. The DOD timeline, I'll handle the timeline. He pulled out his phone, designed the fix. He texted Elizabeth, new issue. Transmission mount resonance. Need to talk. 5 minutes. She replied in 40 seconds, office. He walked through the building, the way he'd walked through it for 6 months. Past the spaces he'd cleaned and the water fountain where Phil sometimes refilled his bottle, and the corridor, where Donna's office light was always the first on in the morning and the last off at night. Except now people looked up when he passed and used his name, and occasionally stopped him with questions that were actually questions rather than politeness. He was getting used to it, not comfortable with it. Getting used to it, which was different. Elizabeth's office was in the same configuration as it had always been, efficient, without sentiment, the kind of space that communicated authority through what it excluded rather than what it contained. She was standing at the window when he came in. How bad, she said. Not bad, serious. Harmonic resonance in the transmission mount, it's not a design flaw, it's a tuning issue. We add a damping system. It's solvable. Timeline, 3 to 4 days design and fab. 2 days of integration testing. We push the demonstration by 1 week. She turned from the window. That's the second extension. Yes, I'll call them with you. He held her gaze. Same approach as last time. Full transparency. Here's what we found. Here's what we're doing about it. Here's why it matters that we found it before deployment rather than after. She looked at him for a moment. The calculation was running, he could see it, but it was running differently than it had run 25 days ago. The weighting had changed. The inputs were the same. Fear and risk and competitive pressure, and the fact that Meridian had finished their demonstration a month ago. All of it was still there. It was just running through a different architecture now. One that had, in the last 25 days, quietly updated its understanding of what the most expensive option actually was. Same answer as last time? She said. Same answer. Tell the truth and pay the cost. Tell the truth and pay the cost. A pause. Elizabeth. This is the last one. After this fix, you're demonstrating a helicopter that we have validated exhaustively, that we understand from the molecular level of its hydraulic circuit to the vibration signature of its transmission mount. What you're bringing to the dude in 8 days is not impressive looking. It's correct. Those are different things, and the people in that room have been around long enough to know the difference. She sat down. He waited. My father built this company on the principle that the most important thing was what the aircraft did the 400th time, not the first time. She looked at the legal pad. I forgot that for about 3 years. You're remembering it now. At substantial cost. Most important things cost something substantial. He stood. I'll set up the call. The second call to the DoD contracting office was shorter. The man in Ohio listened to the technical summary, asked 2 specific questions that told James the evaluation team had actually read the full engineering package from the first extension, and then said something James hadn't expected. Colonel Smith. The shift in address was deliberate. Our evaluation team flagged the initial hydraulic issue 2 weeks ago as the exact failure mode described in the Air Force Rotorcraft Operations Review from 2019. The one you contributed to. James was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure that would be findable. We found it. A pause. The fact that your analysis from 6 years ago and your current diagnostic of this aircraft are consistent suggests we're not dealing with someone who has opinions about helicopters. We're dealing with someone who understands them at the structural level. Another pause. The extension is approved. We'll have our technical team on site for the demonstration. After the call, Elizabeth leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. The 2019 operations review, she said. I wrote part of it 3 months before the injury. He picked up his coffee. It's classified at a level where it shouldn't be findable without clearance, which means their evaluation team has clearance, which means they were already looking at us more seriously than the competition timeline suggested, which means the first extension didn't hurt us as much as I thought. The first extension told them who they were dealing with. The second extension will confirm it. He stood. Chen needs me in the lab. He spent the next 4 days in the hydraulics and structures lab with Chen and 2 mechanical engineers whose names he now knew, Gary and Thomas, both in their late 30s, both the kind of engineers who did their best work when given a specific problem with a real deadline and the room to solve it without someone reframing the problem to make the solution more palatable. The damping system they designed was elegant, in the way good engineering was always elegant, not flashy, not complicated beyond what the problem required, solving exactly the thing it needed to solve, without creating the secondary issue that cheaper solutions would have introduced. James tested the integration at the component level before it went into the aircraft. Then he tested the mathematics against the telemetry signatures from the long-endurance run where the resonance had appeared. The numbers agreed. The design was correct. Chen was at the workbench at 6:30 a.m. on the 3rd day before James arrived, which he knew because her coffee was already half empty when he got there. She'd been running calculations on the damping coefficient. It's going to work, she said without looking up. I just want to say it out loud. She looked up, because 4 months ago I was saying things out loud in rooms where they went directly into the category of concerns that would be addressed later. And now I'm saying it out loud in a room where someone is listening. And I want to mark that, because it matters. He looked at her. 31 years old, the person who'd been right the longest and heard the least. It matters, he said. She went back to the calculations. He went to the bench beside her and started on the integration verification and did not say anything else, because the thing she'd needed was not more words. It was the continued presence of a room that was safe to be accurate in. He could provide that without commentary. On day 26, Brian flew the fully modified Titan for the first time. Full configuration. Both modification integrated. Spring rate adjusted. Damping system installed. Transmission mount balanced. James stood at the telemetry station with the headset on and watched the numbers come in the way he'd watched thousands of data streams across his career, not hoping, not expecting, just reading. The way you read weather, the way you read terrain, the way you read the world as information rather than wish. Brian took it through the full demonstration profile. Every maneuver, every transition, every speed regime, aggressive turns, max power climbs, simulated emergency procedures. The sequences that the DoD evaluation team was going to want to see, run in full now, so that when they ran them in 8 days, nobody in the cockpit would be doing them for the first time. The data was clean, not almost clean, not within acceptable tolerance of clean, actually clean. In the absolute sense of a system that was doing what it had been designed to do without the signature of compromise or hesitation, or the particular strain of something that had been managed rather than fixed. Brian landed and cut the engine, and the rotor slowed and the hangar came back to audible, and, for a moment, nobody said anything. Robert Williams was beside James at the telemetry station. The old engineer looked at the data for a moment. Then he looked at James. Richard would have loved this, he said quietly. Richard Jones, who'd poured the foundation, who'd run this building on the principle that the aircraft mattered more than the timeline, whose daughter had almost lost that principle and had found her way back to it at considerable cost. I know, James said. Robert put a hand briefly on James's shoulder and then walked toward the aircraft to begin the post-flight inspection, because Robert Williams expressed himself primarily through the work and had always preferred it that way. The demonstration day arrived the way significant days always arrived, unremarkably, from the outside. The sun came up on Boulder the same way it came up on every other day. The mountains were exactly where they'd been. The frost on the windshields in the employee parking lot required the same 30 seconds of defrost it always required. Inside Apex Rotorcraft, the atmosphere had the quality of a building that has completed something, not triumphant, completed. The particular quality of a space where the work that needed doing has been done, and what comes next is outside the building's control. And everyone present has arrived at the honest understanding that they've done the thing correctly, and the rest is not theirs to manage. Brigadier General Margaret Wilson arrived at 8:15 a.m. with a team of 3 colonels, 2 technical evaluators from the DoD Rotorcraft Program Office, and an energy that communicated she had read everything sent to her server and was here to see whether the paperwork matched the aircraft. Margaret Wilson at 58 had the posture of someone who had spent her career in rooms where being right was not the same thing as being believed, and who had developed, across those decades, the specific patience of a woman who waited for the evidence and then used it without apology. Her hair was silver and cut precisely. Her uniform carried the weight of the things she'd earned. She walked through the hangar entrance and looked at the Titan X-8 the way a pilot looks at an aircraft, assessing, not admiring. Elizabeth met her at the entrance. General Wilson. No performance, no version. Just Elizabeth Jones, 34 years old, who had made 2 difficult calls to a contracting office and was standing with the consequences. Miss Jones. Margaret looked past her at the hangar, at the Titan, at Brian Thompson completing his pre-flight inspection with the methodical quality of a man who had flown this aircraft 31 times in the past 3 weeks and intended to fly it 31 more times as exactly as he'd flown the previous 31. At Robert Williams and Kay Chen at the data station. At James Smith, standing to the side with his hands in his jacket pockets, wearing the same worn leather jacket over a collared shirt, not the Navy uniform. She looked at James for a moment longer than she looked at anything else. Then she walked toward the aircraft. The demonstration lasted 94 minutes. Brian flew the full profile plus 3 additional sequences that the DoD technical evaluators added mid-demonstration based on what they were seeing, which was, in James's experience, the sign that the evaluation was going well. Evaluators who were making their paperwork look complete didn't add sequences. Evaluators who were genuinely interested added sequences because they wanted to see the edges of what the aircraft could do. Every sequence was clean. Every data point landed where the engineering package said it would land. At the end of the 94th minute, Brian set the Titan down on the painted landing mark, with the particular softness of a man who had stopped performing precision and had simply become precise, and the rotor slowed, and the engine wound down, and the hangar was quiet. Margaret Wilson spent 40 minutes reviewing telemetry with her technical team. James stood away from that conversation and did not insert himself into it, because it was not his conversation and never had been. His part was the aircraft. The aircraft was correct. What happened next was between the aircraft and the people who needed it to do a job that mattered. Margaret walked toward Elizabeth. James watched from 30 feet away. Miss Jones. Her voice carried clearly. What you've built here is exceptional. Not because of the performance numbers. Although those exceed our requirements in every metric. A pause. Because of how you built it. Every decision in the last 4 weeks left a paper trail that tells a story about a company that understands what it's making and who's going to be inside it. She looked at the Titan. In 30 years of procurement, I can count on one hand the companies that called me with problems before I found the problems myself. Elizabeth's expression didn't perform the relief. It simply showed it. Cleanly. Subject to final contract language, Margaret continued, I'm prepared to recommend full approval. Production quantity as originally specified. Then she turned and walked toward James. He'd been expecting this, or had suspected it. Margaret Wilson had been looking at him since she walked through the door with the expression of someone who'd done her reading and was now calibrating the reading against the actual man. Colonel Smith, the title again deliberate. Just James now, General. I've been out 5 years. I know exactly how long you've been out. She held his gaze. I also know about the medical evaluation request from Wright-Patterson. And I know about the Meridian approach, which you declined. He kept his expression neutral. Word travels in this industry. It does. She looked at the Titan. What you've done here, the diagnostic work, the fixed design, the validation methodology, it's a framework, James. It's not a one-time repair. It's a process that our acquisition programs need as a standard. A pause. I'm not offering you a return to active duty. That door is yours to understand. I'm offering you a contract role technical advisor to the Rotorcraft acquisition program. Part-time, remote where possible, travel as needed, which would be manageable. The kind of role that was built for the kind of knowledge you have, which is not replaceable by someone younger, with fewer hours. He looked at the Titan, and then at Robert Williams, who was at the data station, and was not looking at James, because Robert understood that some moments required the person at their center to be alone in them, and at K. Chen, who was reviewing the final telemetry with one of the DoD evaluators, pointing at a specific data column with the direct confidence of someone who had stopped apologizing for her accuracy, and at Brian Thompson, coming down from the cockpit with the particular ease of a man who had flown the aircraft the way he'd known it could be flown and had been correct. And at Elizabeth Jones, standing with Margaret's team, the posture 4 degrees different from the posture she'd walked into a hangar with 30 days ago. Not smaller, more load-bearing, but over the right supports. And at Kevin, who was not here but was everywhere in the sense that the reason for all of it, the 6 a.m. shifts, the 3 p.m. departures, the limits he'd held and the door he'd opened, Kevin was the entire architecture. My son comes home from CU Boulder on Fridays, he said to Margaret. I'm available every Friday at 4 p.m. and not before. Margaret looked at him for a moment, then something changed in her expression, not softening, but a shift. The kind that happens when a person has been encountering the pragmatic version of someone for a while, and has just seen the actual version. Understood, she said, and I want Chen on any technical review panel where the Titans systems are evaluated. She found the problems before I got there. She deserves the attribution. That's already in my notes from the documentation she submitted. Good. He held out his hand. Then we have a deal, General. She shook it. Firm. The handshake of two people who'd spent their careers in situations where agreements needed to be clear. This was clear. The rest of the day happened around James in the way that significant days tended to happen once the significant part was done in fragments, in the peripheral, in conversations he was adjacent to rather than centered in. Elizabeth's team calling the board. Robert opening a bottle of something expensive that had clearly been waiting in his desk for an occasion he hadn't fully believed would arrive. Brian accepting congratulations with the specific graciousness of a man who knew that the credit was distributed more widely than the handshakes were landing. Donna appeared at 4:15 with a facilities form she needed James to sign, which was technically not urgent, and which was actually, he understood, her way of being present in a moment that mattered without requiring a ceremony about it. He signed it. You're going to miss the route, she said. Rodriguez can handle it. Rodriguez is afraid of the North Conference suite bathroom. Rodriguez needs to grow. She smiled. The particular smile of a woman who'd been watching a building run for 11 years. and had very clear opinions about what it looked like when it finally ran correctly. You did good, James. She took the form back. Not the helicopter stuff. A pause. The whole thing. He didn't say anything to that, because it wasn't the kind of statement that needed a response. It needed acknowledgement, and he gave it with a nod, and she went back to her office, and he went to find Robert. Robert was at his workstation, not celebrating, reviewing data. Because Robert Williams celebrated by continuing to work, which was consistent with every version of him James had known across the past 6 months. He sat in the secondary chair. Robert looked up. Done for the day? Almost. Margaret Wilson. Robert set tablet down. She's good people, old school. Means what she says. I know. You took the role. Part-time. Fridays are off. Robert nodded. Richard used to say the best jobs were the ones where the conditions told you something about how much they actually needed you. James looked at the Titan through the hangar window. The aircraft sat in the position it would always occupy now, not a problem to be solved, but a solved problem, which was a different kind of presence, quieter, more certain of itself. The spring rate, he said. Chen had it for 4 months. She did. That's the part that will stay with me. He looked at the older man. Not the fix. How long it took the fix to be heard. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then you know what's different now. She's heard. She's heard. And the next time she says something, she'll be heard faster, because this time is in the record. Robert picked the tablet back up. That's the thing about getting it right once. It changes the prior for every time after. The institution starts to learn. James sat with that for a moment. It was true in the way that structural things were true, not dramatically, not with the emotional weight of a better story, just correctly. The building had learned something. Kei Chen had a different position in it now. Brian Thompson had a different position in it. Elizabeth Jones had a different position in it. One she'd earned by choosing the expensive thing twice in a row when the cheaper thing was available. The building was not fixed. Buildings weren't fixed. They changed, and the change accumulated in the record, and the record became the prior for the next decision. And if the decisions were better, then the institution slowly became the kind of institution that made better decisions. That was the work, not dramatic. Not fast. But he drove home at 5:40, 3 blocks away, parked, walked. The November dark was coming down fast the way it did in this latitude in this month, 4:30 sunset, the sky going from gold to gray to black in the time it took to walk a residential block. The mountains had vanished again. They did this. They were still there. You knew they were still there. He called Kevin from the front step. First ring. Of course. Well, Kevin said. The demonstration went. A pause. They're buying the aircraft, bah. The word carried something he couldn't exactly name. The sound of a person who has been holding something carefully on behalf of someone they love, and has just been told it was okay to put it down. And the deed offered me a contract role. Technical advisory. Part-time, a quiet. What did you say? I said fries are non-negotiable. Another quiet. Longer. Bah. Kevin's voice had shifted, still controlled, but shifted in the way of someone who needs a moment to make sure what they're feeling is in the right order before they let it out. You know what I was thinking about today? In my fluid dynamics lecture, your exam is. I know when my exam is. I was thinking about the first time you explained lift to me. I was 9. We were in the backyard. You used a piece of paper and the garden hose to explain Bernoulli principle. A pause. I didn't understand it then. I did, sort of, but I understand it now, because I'm in the lecture. And the professor is drawing the exact same diagram you drew on the back of a grocery list in the backyard. And I'm sitting in the lecture hall, thinking my father taught me this. My father, who has been cleaning windows for 6 months, who has 9,000 hours, who has been this whole person that nobody knew about. Another pause. I just sat in the lecture and kind of held that for a while. James stood on the front step in the dark. The wind off the mountains was cold. The kind of cold that was clean rather than bitter. The kind that clarified rather than punished. The garden hose, he said. The garden hose. I couldn't find the right materials. Bah, a garden hose and a piece of paper. That's what I learned Bernoulli from. Kevin's voice was steady. The way it got when he wasn't performing anything, when he was just being exactly who he was. I just wanted you to know that, before you go inside, before the day is over. He stood on the step for another moment. The mountains were out there in the dark. Enormous and quiet and entirely themselves, regardless of the weather or the season or what was happening at the base of them. He went inside, made dinner. The hot sauce Kevin had brought from his first week at college, which had become, without formal announcement, the household's permanent condiment. He made enough for one but set 2 plates out of habit, and then didn't correct it. Because the habit was the point. The habit of setting a place for Kevin was the continuous, present tense fact of Kevin being part of the household even when he wasn't in it. He ate. He looked at Laura's photograph. "They bought the helicopter," he said. "The one with the hydraulic lag. We fixed it. Chen figured it out 4 months before anyone listened, and then someone listened, and then we fixed it." He picked up the fork. "Robert says the institution learns." He might be right about that. The photograph. The camping trip. Mountains in the background. "Kevin called me today from a fluid dynamics lecture." A pause. He remembered the garden hose. He finished dinner, he washed the dishes. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone face up this time, not face down. And he looked at the notes he'd made during the technical review sessions, spring rates and damping coefficients, and telemetry signatures, and the particular signature of a harmonic resonance that built slowly in sustained cruise and manifested at hour 47. Of a deployment nobody had been running long enough to see. He looked at the notes for a while. Then he put the phone down and pulled the drawer open. The military ID was there. Laminate yellowing, photo from 12 years ago. The man in the photo had borrowed his face and his hands and his particular way of holding himself when things required full presence. He looked at the ID for a moment. Then he put it back. Not because it was over. Because it wasn't what defined the forward. It was the record, accurate, important, belonging exactly where it was, and the forward was something else. Something that included the work he'd done over the past 30 days, and the role he'd agreed to with Margaret Wilson, and the conversation he'd had with Kevin about Bernoulli Principle, and garden hoses and a 9-year-old who hadn't fully understood it at the time. The forward was the man who showed up at 6 a.m., not because the cart needed pushing but because the aircraft needed fixing. And the engineer needed hearing in the building, needed a different example of what leadership looked like when it didn't mistake the performance of certainty for the thing itself. He was 40 years old. He had 9,200 hours. He had Fridays. He closed the drawer. Outside, the November night was doing its usual thing, cold, clear, the kind of sky that came after the cloud cover broke, more stars than the city usually let you see, the mountains invisible in the dark, but absolutely present in that things were present when you'd learned to know them well enough, that the evidence wasn't required. He went to bed at 9:30. He slept. In the morning he would not push the cart. He would sit across from Chen and review the final integration test results. And he would call the DoD technical office. And he would start building the training framework that would teach other pilots to fly the Titan the way it was meant to be flown. And at 2:30, he would drive to the 3 blocks away parking spot and walk to his truck and drive to CU Boulder and pick up Kevin for the weekend. And they would stop at the diner on Baseline that Kevin had discovered in September and would probably argue about what to order. And Kevin would get the thing he always got, and James would eat half of it. And on the drive back, Kevin would tell him something he'd learned in fluid dynamics. And James would tell him something he'd learned in 30 years of flight. And the translation between those two things would be, as it had always been, the clearest kind of conversation either of them knew how to have. Not every morning was this. Not every day arrived with the particular quality of having completed something. But this one had. And the mountains were out there in the dark, patient, unmoving, entirely themselves, waiting without urgency for the sun to come up and make them visible again.